About 6 miles north of Bakewell, a mile or so west of Stony Middleton, there is a small track which climbs the hill to Riley Top. If you follow this track through its steep wooded sides, the trees on the right will thin out and give a panoramic view of the Derbyshire Dales. On the left, a dry stone wall marks the edge of a large field, in the corner of which there is a small enclosure. What you will find behind this circular wall is a small graveyard containing just 7 graves. On looking around, you'll be aware that there is no church connected with this graveyard, nor has there ever been one. Only these 7 graves surrounded by a wall, all alone on a windswept hillside. As you read what can still be read on the weather-worn gravestones, you will discover that the people to whom they relate all died within a period of just 1 week in August 1666. Clearly there is a story to tell worth the hearing. I will therefore relate this story to you in brief, so that if ever you come to this place, you will be able to stand for a moment in awe of these people who saw their death approach, but stood their ground. They could have fled, but they stayed, rather than take the risk of passing the calamity which had overtaken them to other people. The story of their tragedy starts 20 months before. It was in March 1665 when Mary Cooper, the widow of a lead miner, Edward Cooper, married a tailor by the name of Alexander Hatfield. They lived together in one of the cottages west of the churchyard in the village of Eyam. In order to supply his customers with the latest fashion, Hatfield would order cloth from London. Tradition has it that in late August, early September 1665, one such delivery was made to the Hatfield cottage. The task of checking the order fell to the tailor's assistant, one George Vickers, who was at that time lodging at the cottage. As he began to unpack the box, he became aware of an unpleasant smell emanating from its contents. On further inspection, the rolls of cloth were found to be damp. To address this problem, the cloth was laid out in the kitchen of this very cottage, to air by the fire. It is supposed that infected fleas from the plague-stricken areas of London were unwittingly transported in the rolls of cloth, and that the warmth of the fire caused the newly released fleas to go in search of food. They would, under normal circumstances, have fed on the blood of the black rat, but in the absence of such a meal, the tailor's assistant would do. He would be totally unaware that the fleas that were irritating him today would bring about his death 7 days later from bubonic plague. And so it was that George Vickers, the first victim of the Eyam plague, died on the 7th of September 1665. When 5 more people died within 3 weeks, and in a cluster of 4 neighbouring houses, the Eyam plague was established. By the 12th of June, 76 more people had died. It would be at this time that the vicar of Eyam, one William Mompesson, took it upon himself to take the situation in hand. There was basically 3 parts to his plan, but they all needed the consent of the people of Eyam. The first was that families should bury their dead themselves, and where possible on their own property. The second part of the plan was that the church would be closed until the plague was over, and until that time all collective worship should be made in the open air, The third part of the plan was to seal off the village. Self-imposed quarantine was the only way to ensure that the plague did not spread to the surrounding villages. But for the people of Eyam, having given their word not to leave, all that remained for them was to stay and wait for the plague to visit their house. And for many, they had not long to wait. The lull in May and early June, in which only 3 people died, this was just the calm before the storm. 19 more people would die before the end of June. This number would increase to 56 in July, and August would see the number increase yet again to 77. But these 77 were all real people, as the graves of the Hancock family testify. It is believed that the Hancock's house once stood about here. Their nearest neighbour was the Talbot family, who lived along the lane. But the village itself was about a mile away, and both families hoped that this was far enough to protect them from the plague. They were, however, wrong. How it managed to bridge the distance, no one can say. But on July the 5th, Bridget and Mary Talbot both died from the plague, followed 2 days later by Anne. Jane died 10 days later on the 17th, and Catherine on the 18th. Robert on the 24th, Richard on the 25th, Joan and Ruth on the 26th, and Jonathan on the 30th. This only left the old lady Bridget Talbot and her great-granddaughter Catherine Talbot. It is believed that the task of burying the last of the Talbot family fell to members of the neighbours, the Hancocks. Possibly this is how death came to the Hancocks family, as on the 3rd of August both John and Elizabeth Hancocks were buried. Then on the 7th, Ona, John and William also died. Alice died on the 9th, Anne on the 10th. The task of burying them all fell to Mrs. Hancock. After old Bridget Talbot died on the 15th of August, Mrs. Hancock adopted baby Catherine, only to bury her 2 weeks later. It could have been these combined circumstances that broke her resolve to stay, but she was one of the 2 known to have left Eyam after the quarantine was in place. She went to stay with her only surviving son in Sheffield. Fortunately for the people of Sheffield, she was not carrying any infected fleas. But back in Eyam, September and October saw the plague claim another 43 lives. On the 1st of November, Abraham Morton, the next victim, died. But he was the last. As suddenly as though someone had thrown a switch, inexplicably the plague had ended. The people would have waited in hope and fear, remembering the lull in May. But as November turned into December and then into January, they all would at last dare to believe that it was over. The plague had lasted 14 months and killed 260 people, each with their own story to tell. Had they fled, many of these would have survived, but then the plague would have spread to other villages. This, of course, is all a long time ago, and everyone that was alive then has since died, most of them long forgotten. But for the people of Eyam, who stood their ground in the face of death, these will be remembered and honoured by every generation for all time.